Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about education and technology. Books will soon be obsolete. It is possible to teach every branch of human knowledge with the motion picture. Our school system will be completely changed inside of 10 years. This quote, or rather the date of it, really shows us how hyped educational technologies can be. Whereas Paul Kirschner has argued there have only ever been two real revolutions with respect to teaching, those being the printing press and the blackboard. With the printing press, books became widely available, meaning a wealth of information could now be accessed by the many. Before that, only the rich were able to own the scarce few. And at the start of the 1800s, blackboards were introduced. Prior to that, schools were often one-room buildings where students worked on their own, copying out texts. Suddenly, blackboards meant teachers could work with large groups of students at once and reduce the need to buy ink and books. Although both the printing press and the blackboard can seem archaic in a way, Kirschner argues that most of the innovations up until relatively recently have just been expansions on the blackboard and the printing press. So how can we avoid the hype of educational technologies and really judge the efficacy of them? A lot of the ideas in this session are taken from Christodoulou's 2020 book, Teachers vs. Tech, The Case for an EdTech Revolution. In it, she has lots of suggestions for good EdTech, as it's sometimes shortened to. But today I want to focus on three of her ideas, and that is that good educational technology should adhere to the science of learning, not just be for looking up information, and that it shouldn't distract us. If you do find any aspects of this session interesting, I highly recommend that you take a look at this book as well, because it's really well written. So when Christodoulou talks about the science of learning, it's the proposition that learning involves the interaction of three arenas. That we have a working memory, which you might refer to as consciousness, that is limited to 4 to 7 items. Well, that's the claim. And how this interacts with stimulus, or the outside world, or in the case of a classroom, learning material. And how our working memories are supported by our long-term memories, which she describes as a well-organized, elaborate knowledge structure that provides us with a way of making sense of the everyday information we encounter. So think of when you present your students with a reading or perhaps an utterance that is filled with for them what is too much unfamiliar vocabulary. In trying to understand the material, their working memories become overwhelmed. Remember, the claim is that the working memories can only hold 4 to 7 items at a time. And if they're unfamiliar with these words, then their background knowledge isn't able to support them. Therefore, understanding nor learning takes place. So the implication for educational technology is that in order to help learning, it shouldn't overwhelm our cognitive capacity, and it should build our long-term memory, not replace it. Well, surely we can just Google a fact if we don't know it. And yes, there are strong arguments for it being no longer relevant to learn facts when we can look them up so easily. So shouldn't we be learning problem-solving skills and how to evaluate? It might be, as Don Tapscott said in 2008, teachers are no longer the fountain of knowledge, the internet is. Well, the internet is a fountain of knowledge. However, Christodoulou argues against replacing our background knowledge with it for 3 key reasons. Those being that we need facts in long-term memory to think, otherwise our working memories would get overwhelmed too easily. The second point, that even with reliable sources, we need facts in long-term memory to be able to make sense of that information. And her third point is that generic evaluation skills will not help us identify unreliable online resources. Let's take an example from the world of TESOL or TEFL. Let's say your student says to you, "I had a good weekend," but you want them to use more interesting vocabulary, so you say, try and use a more interesting word than good. So your student goes to his phone or a device and Googles good synonyms. Then they look at you and say, "I had a righteous weekend." The point being that we need facts in order to think, and in the case of our student, he needs the correct vocabulary to answer the question appropriately. A really well illustrated example of this is a case study of chess players that was done by Simon and Chase, where they showed expert players chessboards from actual and typical games with 25 pieces on them for a few seconds. They were able to reproduce the scenarios with almost no errors, whereas when they showed the same boards to novice players, they were only able to successfully recreate 8 to 10 pieces. So then they changed it. They then moved the chess pieces to random positions rather than from actual games, and what they found was that the novices and the experts performed equally as well when the pieces were in random positions. The findings ultimately suggesting that it was the chess master's long-term memory of different scenarios that allowed them to recreate the typical positions. The implication being that our ability to think, learn, assess online information relies on the long-term memory. You may have heard about AlphaGo, the computer program that beat master players at the ancient Chinese game of Go. It did this with a team of very intelligent engineers building its background knowledge, if we can call it that. Now, I think well after it first beat a human, it is now capable of teaching itself the game from scratch, for reasons I have no idea about, and has even come up with strategies for playing which have never been seen before. Hopefully this artificial intelligence will be deployed in education, and hopefully for improving it and improving our long-term memories, but it actually segues nicely into my next topic, as this technology was purchased by Google and is used by YouTube to recommend videos, which keeps you watching, and it brings up this worrying notion that modern devices are not neutral and how they can undermine our attention and therefore our ability to learn. So to begin with, talking about distraction, I can say that it's a phenomenon that affects us all, and everyone's got their own personal experience of it, but I think it's better to consult research on the area. Kate Greenberg and Walker did some research in 2016 where students were allowed to bring devices to some parts of the course and not to others. Perhaps unsurprising to anyone who owns a smartphone, they did better on the sections where they weren't allowed to bring the devices. Another study 2 years later done by Glass and Kang split students into two separate groups. One group was allowed to bring devices and one was not. Otherwise, they received the exact same lecture. And again, unsurprisingly, the no device group did better. The research also touched on how even seeing someone else multitasking on their smartphone has enough of a distraction to affect learning. And one piece of research I'd like to mention as well was done at the University of Texas, and it found that people performed better in a series of cognitive tests when their phones were in another room compared to when on the desk in front of them. So it may or may not seem obvious to us, and there could be generational differences in this area, but it's worth thinking how detrimental devices are in our students' learning and out of the classroom, and what we can do to help. Also, it might be worth rewinding the video if you've watched this with your phone on the desk. So I've talked a lot about the history of educational technology and also what educational technology should and shouldn't do, but now I want to touch on how it will or might change technology based on what I've talked about. So, firstly, personalization. If, as the science of learning suggests, we need facts to think, and everyone has a slightly different background knowledge, then successful personalization of materials offers learners the best chance of progress. And we talk a lot about differentiation and ranges of competency in our classrooms, and studies by Bloom and Slavin have illustrated personalized learning's advantages over group learning. So, what is modern technology offering? Perhaps the most promising is adaptive learning. Adaptive learning tools collect specific information about individual students' behaviours by tracking how they answer questions. The tool then responds to each student by changing the learning experience to better suit that person's needs, based on their unique and specific behaviours and answers. So essentially, these technologies try to replicate what an expert teacher could do with unlimited time and attention. Suppose an adaptive learning system gives this question. Look at the following sentence. Which word is a finite verb? She was thought to have been told to have herself examined. And suppose thought was given as an answer. The system might hint by asking, is that really appropriate? And suppose that doesn't help. The system might give a simpler question. Which is the finite verb? They have considered running. And suppose that doesn't help. The system might give nuggets of information, tutorials, videos, or more simpler exercises. Christodoulou says that the most complex and powerful adaptive systems build a model of both the subject being taught and each individual student's understanding of it. There are obviously limitations with these systems, not just in design but in their implementation. They're also expensive, time-consuming to develop, and how they deal with the ambiguity of certain aspects of language learning hasn't really been explored. However, the research does suggest they are a more effective way of personalizing learning than learning styles or student choice. And their greatest strength appears to be the attention to detail that students often struggle with, which over the time, if left uncorrected, compound and lead to problems down the road. And when you consider a computer can now teach itself the ancient game of Go, beat the world's best, and reinvent ways to play it, we've only really scratched the surface of what artificial intelligence will do in education. Next, I want to talk about spaced repetition. Imagine a movie montage. The first shot of the protagonist on the treadmill, he is unfit, and a few shots later, the target practices faultless. Their IQ is improved and they're no longer throwing up mid-exercise. A spaced repetition approach is like that, but without the music and a lot more repetition and time involved. Informed by the 19th century researcher Ebbinghouse's tests on his own memory, he proposed that we start forgetting what we've learned immediately, even after learning it perfectly. But by reviewing, we can slow the forgetting down. This seems obvious, right? We're always telling our students to review. But his research also showed how to interrupt the forgetting curve, as it's sometimes called, and that if he spaced out his sessions over 3 days, he only needed half the amount of time to learn a list of syllables. Spaced repetition approaches show better performance over cramming in the long term, and this perhaps raises questions of how we use time prepping for tests, and even how we test. Christodoulou, elaborating on the work of Robert Bjork, said, "When we study a topic intensively in a short period of time, we can often display high levels of performance and feel confident that we have truly understood the material. But that feeling of confidence is misleading. In the words of Robert Bjork, a leading researcher in this area, performance is not the same as learning. Spacing out practice may not give you the same fluency in the short term, but it is far better in the long term." Anki is a well-known app in the language learning communities and is essentially a flashcard making app. In my personal experience, its regular utilization leads to more accuracy and access to the learned language. But there are others that are even more advanced and create visualizations of your own forgetting curve. And there is hope that large data sets from these kinds of applications will be able to reveal patterns in different content areas and help teachers in the way that they teach the specific content that is easier to forget. Beyond technologies being personalized and efficiently reviewed, it is also important that they are memorable. Let's take a look at some of the work of Richard E. Mayer, who developed principles for multimedia learning, and specifically one experiment that he did. He had 2 groups and gave one this paragraph about how a bicycle pump works. And he gave another group this diagram. The second group remembered more, and this experiment has been replicated in many other studies. The explanation is that combining words and visuals, we build more sophisticated mental representations of the concept we are trying to learn. Further studies have suggested that appropriate integration of the words into the text makes it even more efficient. We will have seen throughout our teaching the effective design of materials, but the potential to advance these principles within green screen technology, video production, app design, touchscreen, etc. will expand on what's already possible. The final area I want to look at is assessment and how technology can improve it. So there's a lot of criticism made about particularly essay writing, of how subjectively it is marked. An American study gave trained examiners the same essay 2 years in a row without their knowledge. On a 6-point scale, they found only 20% of them gave the same mark both times. Similar research that compared UK examiners against each other on a typical 40-mark essay question found a discrepancy of a ±5 marks on average. So is it that humans are biased and so inconsistent, or that marking criteria is too interpretive? Well, let's first consider how humans judge. How tall is this man? What do you think? 187 centimeters? 5'3", 200 centimeters? Now, what about these two? If I just ask you who is taller, it's a lot easier to answer that, isn't it? And what about if I asked you to put these men in order from tallest to shortest? It'd be pretty straightforward to do that too. And of course, marking essays is more difficult than judging a group of people's heights. However, the principle remains. There's new software that allows multiple essays to be uploaded and compared on different criteria, side by side, and by multiple teachers to create a much more credible scale. Although this does remove a lot of biases, it doesn't necessarily give us a final score. And this is where the advocates suggest it needs to be combined with more human expertise, and the larger the comparison group, the better. The technologies I have looked at haven't been explicitly focused on second language acquisition, but more applicable across education generally, and I could have gone into a lot more depth with each one. In preparation for the session, I would like you to choose a piece of technology. It could be anything: Duolingo, HelloTalk, Google Slides, even YouTube, for teachers or learners to use. And I want you to think about how you could use it, either in a lesson or alone, and its impact on learning. And I want you to assess its strengths and weaknesses. And also, don't worry if you do the same as another candidate. I think it would add more depth to the discussion for that particular technology if we have more than one person talking about it. And thank you for taking the time to watch this video.